and welcome to Debate Night over on Superpower Broadcasting here. Tonight, I am debating lucisev here, and we are going to be debating capitalism versus socialism. So this is going to be an interesting debate. We don't often debate economics, but here we are. And so thanks for coming on. Here's lucisev. Feel free to introduce yourself, your work, and what you're about.
Hi, my name is Lucy. My name is lucisev. I don't really have too much political clout on the internet whatsoever, but I'm very interested in talking about ideas and testing them against other arguments. I consider myself a libertarian socialist primarily, and I'm very much a fan of the values of the Enlightenment that include what is it called? Liberty, fraternity, and whatever the other one is.
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. So, and just to let people know, I'll probably be back on my webcam within the next couple days or so. We actually had basically a heat wave where I'm out right now, and I didn't even have fans or anything, but got fans and everything. So I'll be suited up and everything for the next debate, hopefully. But I appreciate you, rolling with your face and everything, because it's like a lot of people they roll anonymous and whatnot, and it's like I get why people do it, and you can have a lot of legitimate reasons to do it, but it definitely lends more respectability to somebody's argument when they come and debate me with their face, So, and anyway, so you mentioned libertarian socialism, so you, I guess, would see yourself in opposition to the tankies, that kind of stuff,
Yes,
like the meme
exactly.
of authoritarians. Okay.
Yes.
So I guess the first question that kind of arises, and I mean, normally with these kinds of debates, we have opening statements and whatnot. We can do that, but I had a couple questions just kind of about your economic perspective. The first one would be, how do you have a transition to a socialist system from a capitalist system without having to invoke authoritarian methods to transition to it?
Well, I guess the primary way that I would ideally hope to achieve a transition to a socialist system would probably be spreading, my ideas and getting it through democratically, probably slowly implementing reforms that would increase the overall economic power of the worker and the average person, such as, a strong welfare system and decommodification of things like healthcare, food, housing, even. And from there, there's always things to improve.
Okay, well, you mentioned the decommodification of housing and agriculture, or not necessarily agriculture, but food, that kind of stuff. And I don't mean to so much make this an interview. I'm just kind of a little bit curious about where you're coming from, because the last time I debated more of a socialist person, he's Uncle Thomas, and he basically identifies as a national Bolshevik, and so he's a lot more authoritarian. And basically imagine like a more left-wing kind of Nick Fuentes kind of guy almost in some ways. I guess the kind of question that I have before we get into more maybe confrontational, maybe not kind of debate format is, well, the issue that anybody that is familiar with economics of history would bring up, though, is that when it's been tried to decommodify those kinds of basic goods or basic necessities as they're characterized, it's oftentimes been a disaster. And not just talking about like Cuba or the Soviet Union, because you're obviously against those systems, but even you can look at the public housing system that's been attempted in the US with the projects and everything, and it turned into a disaster. And so how would you avoid the basically the free rider problem, the tragedy of the commons, all that kind of stuff, from befalling a socialized housing system? How would you ensure that it didn't become dilapidated and whatnot if people don't really feel ownership over their own property?
Yeah, I'm not like especially against like a market system. In fact, I would say that a good transition way to get to full-on socialism would probably be through a market socialist system. I would probably look at what needs are being addressed correctly by the current markets, and what needs could be improved upon by something like government intervention. I'm not exactly familiar with the minutia of things like the public housing or the housing crisis, but I think taking steps in the direction and taking kind of like a case by case basis, maybe even like more of a local implementation, and then broadening out from there would probably be good. But like I would never advocate for any policy that would like devastate different areas just for the sake of decommodifying it.
Okay. Yeah, I think the worry, one of the big things that I've got with socialism, big sort of contentions, is that, especially on your side of it, it seems to be a lot of more or less well-intentioned folks that don't necessarily understand how human nature gets into it, how things can obviously go south. And I'm not even talking about dictatorship necessarily here. I'm just talking about how in cases where we've seen, when you've had that sort of big welfare statist sort of project attempted, it's tended to result in poverty traps. It's tended to result in the first few years of the public housing is great. Everybody's excited to move in. And then they wind up looking like Soviet Khrushchevkas after like 10 years, basically, in America. And so for me, I understand that like total free market ANCAP capitalism and all that stuff. It's like there's some of the most prominent people that I debate. I'm pretty opposed to their almost solipsistic social Darwinist worldview. I personally believe that like negative income tax, or even as a compromise, universal basic income is a better way of achieving economic opportunity for people as opposed to the welfare state. But what's your view, I guess, on these methods of providing a basic income to account for necessities that seek to bypass traditional welfare statism? Do you have faith in those, or are you skeptical of them?
As I've said, I'm not completely familiar with the minutia, but I think something like an investment in specifically in like jobs programs and into the infrastructure of communities that have been historically like impoverished, and a large push for unionization, which would lead to higher wages for workers, maybe to the point where we don't even need a minimum wage, and perhaps along with a universal basic income would probably help secure people's access to necessities.
Okay. But you mentioned the basic income. Would that be, I guess the issue is because of the expenses and everything. Some people have argued that they're not against the proposal, but they think that it should be in addition to the welfare state. For me, I see that as far too costly. I see it as basically an alternative to get rid of the bureaucracy, but put money in the hands of individuals so they're not stigmatized according to, the traditional means testing bureaucracy. I personally am of the view here that if you were to impose that kind of cost by way of levying taxes, or alternatively to go more into debt, that you would actually do more economic harm than good in aggregate. But what do you make of that?
Yeah, I would never want any policy to be implemented that would drive America into like massive amounts of debt. Though, from my understanding, of the way that our current fiat currency system works, is that debt is almost kind of negligible. Though I could not say that with a very strong conviction. But I think I'm not principally opposed against a UBI. I think it could be helpful, and perhaps in addition to specific other welfare programs to help people like single parents or disabled people. But I wouldn't be principally opposed to like eliminating some other forms of welfare in exchange for a UBI.
Okay. Yeah, well, no, that's an interesting place to start. I guess we can kind of go into more sort of formalized sort of debate setting. If you have like any sort of like opening sort of remarks to kind of make the case for libertarian socialism, kind of like on a general level of why we need it, why capitalism is flawed, and how yours could improve on it without introducing, a net decrease in the standard of living.
So I think one of the important things when we have discussions about capitalism versus socialism is probably to make sure that we define our terms, and so we have a common understanding, so we're not like assuming what one another means and talk past each other. So would you like me to like give my definition of capitalism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we can agree on the definition of socialism and the definition of capitalism, that'll probably make this debate a lot more efficient then.
Yeah. So my definition of capitalism would be a socioeconomic system where there are employers, employees, in which the process of production is privately owned by employers slash owners who hire employees slash workers for a wage to work said production. The main motivation for production under capitalism would be the profit motive.
Yeah, I would agree with that definition. Although I would note that the presence of even a somewhat large government sector wouldn't mean that a company or a country rather wasn't capitalist. So,
But
like,
yeah,
could we agree that Scandinavia, for example, is actually capitalist? They just happen to have like a social democratic.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
okay. Because I know some people have called them socialists, and it's like they're not. So
Yeah, yeah, they're social democracies more
yeah.
so.
And then what's your definition of socialism?
Uh, it would be a socioeconomic system in which production is owned and operated collectively by workers. In my case, I would say that in the transition to socialism, we would probably still have a market system, so there'd still be businesses. So it would be kind of like a worker cooperative situation, and certain key industries become decommodified in order to ensure the basic welfare of the population. And additionally, it's kind of like a transitionary stage towards what we broadly call communism, though that is kind of like a completely far away goal and not something I really like to focus on.
Okay. Okay, because I know a lot of people kind of define socialism in respect to what it's trying to accomplish, and so there are more or less, I guess more like authoritarian type people that kind of see socialism as an end goal almost in and of itself. But would you say that communism is the end goal down the road of what you're trying to accomplish, say in 1,000 years or 500 years or however long the roadmap is, or?
Yeah, I would say like communism would be a stateless, classless, moneyless society, but I feel as though that would be a good end goal or like an ideal to try to adhere to the best of the ability. However, I kind of don't like people who get too wrapped up in that because I think it does lead to authoritarianism because like, oh, we need communism right now, so let's just forget democracy, forget principles of liberty and stuff like that. So I try to focus on what we can do right now to achieve better outcomes.
Okay. What would you, I guess, what would you consider to be areas, let's say one or two areas that capitalism, as you see it, has been, I guess, a failure or failed to a large extent?
I would say that in line with the principles of the Enlightenment, I feel as though that capitalism, that the capitalism, since it came out of feudalism, I would say capitalism is a much larger improvement over the previous system. I think it's done an extreme amount of good to improve the overall living standard for society. We wouldn't be where we are today without capitalism. So I'm not like one of those people who thinks capitalism is like this completely evil thing. I just think it doesn't go far enough in terms of liberating the average person.
Okay. So for me, when I look at capitalism, I think of capitalism as kind of the opposite of how some people on the left will look at capitalism as kind of like in its late stage. For me, I see capitalism as like just coming out of its infancy. I see the Industrial Revolution as like it's like a 1 year old having a temper tantrum. There's not very much economic justice or anything, but that I see the kind of the growing stage towards adolescence being basic income and moving towards a more mature sort of social contract. But for me, I still see preserving the principles of capitalism as a good thing, and so my issue is just about raising the floor so much. But I don't actually personally care if somebody say makes $100 billion. I just care that everybody has as much of an equal opportunity to become a billionaire, that kind of thing, if they want to. Whereas you can't necessarily say that that's the case today, but 100 years ago it definitely wasn't the case. And so I see capitalism as just a system that over time incrementally does improve itself, and it's not necessarily revolutionary. It was revolutionary in its early days, but I see revolution as coming with so many pitfalls that if you speed up things tremendously, you risk sending the system into chaos and then basically arriving in a fascist system or a totalitarian system of some sort. That's kind of my worry. And my worry with a transition to a socialist system is that I don't actually personally worry about people that do consider themselves libertarian socialists. What I worry about is that the power vacuum that arises from the transition is going to lead to tankies winning that power struggle. I don't think that you guys would win that power struggle. I don't think people like you, just based on talking to you, I don't think you could have 1,000 people lined up and shot each night. I don't really get
No,
those
yeah.
vibes. But
No, yeah,
somebody who
definitely.
is willing to, they'll rise to the top. It's kind of like how the most ruthless businessman often rises to the top in capitalism, right? So
Yeah,
that's the worry. Is like how do you transition, because the system that you're basically proposing, it's not incompatible with democracy per se. You could technically have a democratic socialist system like what you're advocating for, but though the thing is, the current system isn't going to just kind of go along with what you're suggesting, right? And so Vosh, for example, as the libertarian socialist, has said that you would probably need to do a violent revolution to get there. And so for me, I see a violent revolution as guaranteeing a Stalin type figure wins that. But do you in any way sort of support a violent revolution? I know it's a couple questions, but
yeah.
or would you say it would have to be within the current sort of social contract, the current system?
I can answer that question, but do you think after that I could go off of something else that you said?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think I would say I like when I probably like a year or two ago, I would say that like I kind of fell down the tanky pipeline. And when you're kind of like a young person who has very strong convictions of the world, it's very easy to be like, oh, we really need a revolution right now to fix things. But first of all, it's really hard to get people on your side to want to do revolution, because that's going to lead to a lot of societal ills in which the standard of living would go down. Like people would be devastated, and many people wouldn't want to risk, like even if they were suffering under capitalism, they wouldn't want to risk like the relative standard of living they have just to do some kind of revolution to get rid of capitalism, right? But I do agree that in terms of like revolutions that you've seen around the world, such as with the USSR and China, that when a powerful figure takes head, they kind of it's hard for them to get rid of that power, and so kind of becomes an authoritarian regime. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a fan of revolution, but I think that in cases where like if there is a mass push for like social democratic or socialist reform in this country, in which the owning class capitalists would see a threat to that and start like hiring like private militaries to like push back against that, I would say that action in defense would be justified, but I would never advocate for like a rising up against the system, because that, like I said, doesn't really lead to extremely good outcomes historically.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm a pretty big critic of private militaries. I think that they should outright be banned personally. I mean,
Agreed.
So I think that's an area of common ground there. And I know historically in the past, they would hire private militaries to basically go in and smash people that disagreed with them. And
Yeah,
so
they kill union workers and stuff like that.
yeah, that kind of stuff. And so for me, the main thing is that regardless of which way we're going to reform, it has to be about maintaining the rule of law system that we have here. And so, do you see the socialist sort of system that you would advocate for? You hark back to the Enlightenment values and everything. It seems like you're basically advocating for them as an almost more sort of enlightened version of the West than what we have right now, and that's something that I think I would disagree with, though, because for me, I see part of the whole project of the Enlightenment basically as being about a big sort of emphasis on individual agency and whatnot. And how would you respond, I guess, to somebody that might say, well, the best solution for people that might be working class or whatnot is figure out what you want to do, start a business or whatever, and then try to basically become successful that way. What would you make about that argument, that basically that what you're kind of proposing almost sounds like a form of collectivism as opposed to individualism? I'm not sure if you would agree with that characteristic, or
Um,
characterization.
I would say to somebody who would say that would be that if we're looking at it at things in like a statistical sense, it is very unlikely for the average working person to be able to find a market niche, to be able to found a business to meet a market demand that isn't already being met by some larger corporation. Though there are obviously cases people are still making businesses and finding success, and there's also however, there is an issue in which there's not really the average working class person doesn't really have access to the capital to start a business, nor really be able to come up with an idea to start a business to meet a certain market demand if they're working, say, like 2 to 3 jobs, or if they're just focusing on meeting rent or whatever. I do take issue with a lot of the what we call traditional libertarian mindset of like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and trying to do something that would take that in comparison to somebody in a more well-off position would take much more of your time and energy that you might not have if you're working class.
Okay. What would you make though about the argument about innovation, that a system that you've described wouldn't produce as much innovation as a more competitive market system? Like you described your system as market socialist, but at the end of the day, it was basically workers owning their own means of production. The issue that arises there is that depending on how you structure a co-op, depending on how you structure that sort of conglomerate or whatever, you might run into the case where you're not necessarily having the best specialization division of labor, and ingenuity might suffer. And an example of that, of course, historically would be things like the Soviet Union, but even to a lesser extent, some of the socialist projects in the UK, where they've tried, more of a co-op type thing where you get everybody to do various stuff, and it doesn't necessarily perform as well as when you have people that do dedicated tasks and that kind of stuff. What would your form of a co-op look like, I guess,
Well, my priority is so this kind of goes back to my value of liberty. I think that the traditional firm system where you have an employer and then you have employees under you, obviously different managing positions, stuff like that, it's tiered. I would say that the current firm structure is very antithetical to bring liberty to the individual, as I think it limits a worker's ability to have a meaningful impact on their day-to-day life. If they're working at a business, they don't really have a say in how resources are managed and how managers might go about managing the business. And my worker co-op would probably I don't have a conception of like everybody is just like flat on the same level, being paid the same, doing different tasks on their own. But I do value the tiered management system. I would just say that we would that there would be different tiered like boards in which that would be elected that are what's the word, that are able to be scrutinized by the workers, and if the workers are unsatisfied with the management, they can hold a vote. And since every worker owns a stake in the business, they would be more concerned with the health of the business, because they are directly affected by how much profit the business attains.
Okay, I see. I mean, one sort of phenomenon that you can say it's a thing in both traditionally socialist systems and in capitalist systems today is that a lot of workers don't actually particularly care too much about what they're doing. They just do what they do for a paycheck, whether that was in the Soviet Union or whether that's at Walmart today. That if you ask them, what do you think about the management's decision here or there? Some people might not actually care, especially the further up the ladder you go, the further distance they are. They're probably not going to care too much about what the minutes were at a, say, a Walmart board meeting or something half a country away, when they're just basically, they're not even necessarily particularly passionate about it. They're just doing that because they're not necessarily sure what else they want to do or anything. What would you make though about the idea that, well, if a lot of workers aren't necessarily particularly passionate about what they're doing, maybe it is better off that you have executives that are responsible solely for the trajectory of the company, because they're literally paid to just focus on those sorts of aspects of the company as opposed to, say, routine work, that kind of thing.
I would probably say that workers at a given business, say if it's like, say if we're using a hypothetical cooperative Walmart, the workers working there would probably, since they do have stake in the business, they would probably be primarily concerned with the goings on at that specific like Walmart, and how it's run. And there'd probably still likely be positions that would focus on performing executive actions, though they are subject to the democratic wills of their employees. Like I wouldn't say that if you're that high up making like important decisions like that, you wouldn't, you couldn't get voted out by like, people just like the 50 people that work at Walmart B or whatever. But the workers at any given Walmart elect the manager for their Walmart, and then they have the power to elect the people above them, and so on until you have the people roughly at the top, but that are still subject to the democratic wills of the people below them.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about this? I mean, I don't actually have any problem with somebody starting a company and structuring it this way. I think the contention that a lot of people would have, I think almost anybody that would even call themselves a capitalist would probably say, if you want to start a co-op, by all means. I mean, we got some pretty successful co-ops in the West already. The issue, I guess, would become, well, let's take Walmart, for example. Walmart's a big company. The Walton family, they're never going to willfully transition over to a democratically elected system, because they would say, well, our family founded this and they intended it to be like a family sort of enterprise. What would you do with that? Would you let them keep on doing their thing, but then have subsidies for co-ops so that they compete with and eventually become the dominant thing? Or would you make corporate ownership outright illegal in order to do that? Or would you take it on a firm by firm basis?
I would probably implement like preferred loans for cooperatives, for people to start cooperatives. However, since I believe that the traditional firm is morally antithetical to the liberty that I'm seeking, I would say that it's almost a necessity to transfer current businesses into a cooperative model. But I wouldn't implement an executive order or anything like that to instantly make them cooperatives. It would probably be like a slow transition over like so many years. Like you have to be a co-op by this date, or slowly turning parts of the business into more democratic things until eventually it becomes a full-on cooperative.
Yeah. Well, I guess the thing for me is, like, I could accept an economy that was entirely run by co-ops if it was like more or less a natural sort of thing. So like, let's say you have the Walmarts of today, you got all these big sort of companies as you have today, but then you also have increasingly more co-ops come about. And if the system that you're kind of describing is truly the best, then I would expect it to be more productive and outcompete with the Walmarts. And I would expect them to eventually either go under or themselves reform to be co-ops so that they can generate more money as they see others be more productive. So I guess the worry that I kind of have there is that if you set, say, a date that you have to be a co-op within 30 years, it almost seems like an admission that you don't necessarily, and I'm not necessarily saying that you're implying this, because Walmart obviously
Mm.
had a huge head start to consolidate their corporate war chest and everything. But I almost get the sense that there is, from some people that will advocate for this kind of knowledge that, well, if they don't mandate it, that the co-ops won't be able to compete with private companies. But do you think that in a free market, I guess, or in a market, that a co-op could legitimately compete with a private company, assuming they had the same workforce and assuming they had the same revenue? Do you think that the co-op would actually outperform it by traditional profit standards, or would you say profit isn't really that important at the end of the day?
Well, in my system, it would still be motivated by profit, because of something you said earlier, innovativeness. I do think that capitalism does beget some form of innovativeness, through if we broadly look at the history of Western capitalist countries. But I think a cooperative could effectively compete. However, I think one issue I have with capitalism is that the big players like Amazon, Walmart, etc., have such a stranglehold on its specific corner of the market and access to almost like exclusive access to different supply chains, is that it would be really difficult for a cooperative to take hold, such that it would be able to properly compete with a traditional firm.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can see that working against, almost like having to swim upstream. But the argument that a co-op would be a better place to work, though, you could make the argument that, well, without mandating anything, wouldn't the workers at Amazon or something want to go to a co-op? Because the co-ops that are often described by, libertarian socialists, they're described in a way that makes them sound very appealing. Do you think that appeal force would be enough to drive away labor from the other places, so that they'd have to pay their workers more in order to get an equilibrium? Or would there even be an equilibrium? Or is it that you you really can't compete in terms of the standard of working? Because I'm aware that Amazon has gotten in a fair bit of trouble over some of their working conditions. And so um it seems like to me that if the co-op system were truly a superior thing, all that you would really have to do is just kind of start a co-op, advertise that you're hiring people, advertise the benefits of working there, and then Amazon's going to have to pay like $30 an hour to keep people working there. Why hasn't that happened yet? Because there are co-ops around. So
I think that for a business to properly incentivize workers to a cooperative business to incentivize workers to come over to there would need to be up to a certain size in order to be to offer competitive pay rates to the workers as compared to Amazon. I actually do work at an Amazon warehouse.
okay.
It's not like as terrible as everybody says it is. The pee bottle stuff, I can go to the bathroom whenever I want. It's not all like that. But I would say that that I'm not really worried too much about like the effective productiveness up to a certain point of cooperative. I care. If we like mandated co-ops and then the economy would just kind of like crash because of that, I wouldn't want that. I would still want economic growth and opportunities for working class people. But
Yeah.
I would say that there are currently like a lot of barriers to entry for cooperatives because it's not a traditional firm, and other businesses would probably are able to lobby against such businesses from becoming like a kind of more of a mainstream idea and a more commonplace form of business.
Yeah, I think on that point though, I think about co-ops and whatnot, uh, and I do kind of think that it's not so much the worry for me is that you're going to crash the economy. I don't think that's going to happen. I think a lot of people would say that to basically fearmonger against co-ops.
Hmm.
Co-ops in a marketplace aren't the end of the world. I think the worry is that maybe instead of having an aggregate economic growth per year of say 2.5%, maybe you go down to 1.5%, and then over 50 years you're looking at a difference of like 3 times bigger economy. That's kind of the worry, that a couple percent each year isn't that big of a deal, but if you expand that out over generations, you're talking about the difference between South Korea and North Korea in terms of standard of living. Not to say that the US would be like North Korea, but that other sort of free market companies would basically leave the US behind in 50 years, because they'd have a higher growth rate. And so it's not even stagnation, it's slower growth is my worry about co-ops. And I think the reason why is largely that I see the real competitiveness of the system right now as driving a lot of the innovation. And you could still have a really competitive system with different co-ops competing against each other. But I guess I'll cite somebody in the chat, one of the longtime viewers, is that, Kirk Wilcox, he mentions, one of the big advantages of being an employee is not having to worry about big decisions, risks, and responsibilities. That's kind of where I'm coming from here, which is that not everybody's necessarily going to have a valuable input on bigger government decisions within a company. And so you could structure in a way so that everybody's just voting for somebody to make those decisions. But what happens if you kind of have like a Trump figure get elected and they screw everything up? That could be a worry. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that, well, people will care, they'll pay more attention because they're making money based on the output of the company. But you could argue that if you're in America, you have a vested interest in the productivity and the survival of your country. And yet, what was it, like over 50 million people went and voted for a guy that, as I see it, owed a lot of money to the Russians. And so, they would all say they cared about America, but I think they screwed up. Obviously, I would have supported Hillary Clinton, but how would you kind of address that? I know it's almost making like an anti-democratic argument here, but I see firms as a little bit different. But
oh no, I totally understand I would completely agree that maybe even in a, like, say that every business is co-ops, that there still be people that necessarily don't care about like the bigger picture things about the company and kind of do just go there to get paid. However, I would say that well, like I said, that workers at a given single like franchise or whatever would be concerned mostly about the goings on there, and they would be concerned about the overall health of the business. But their immediate concerns would only be at that one place of business, and they wouldn't necessarily have to worry about like the higher up things. And I would say that even people who don't even care about the immediate place of business would probably be able to defer their vote to somebody else in their place who does care more.
Okay. I mean, and I don't even necessarily see it as big of a deal of the issue of Trump, because if a company wants to vote in a clown and have a clown show of it, they can go bankrupt and then another firm can do the job better. It's not like it's necessarily the end of the world. It's just, it's I guess the aggregate system is that a lot of people have this sort of skepticism around co-ops that, that they're not necessarily going to be as productive. But, you're right to note there hasn't been, necessarily a fair competition between them just because of the percentage of co-ops to the percentage of traditional firms. But I'll say this. If you have a platform and you get elected and you run on telling people that you're going to give small business loans, giving preference to co-ops starting up, and that those co-ops can be run in the kind of way that you're describing, I actually wouldn't have any issue with that whatsoever if that's what the people want. My worry, my main opposition, when I talk about anti-communism, all that kind of stuff, it's particularly in opposition to, authoritarianism, an opposition to revolution, all that kind of stuff. And that doesn't really necessarily seem to be what you're advocating for here. And so it's some common ground, but I don't necessarily agree with the mandate, though, even if it is over a long period of time, because for me, if 90% of the economy naturally tends towards being co-ops over 100 years, that's fine with me in a competition. That's a free market. That's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. Um, but I still think that if you found a company, it's still your property basically. So I believe in personal property rights, that kind of stuff. Would there be private property in the system that you're describing? Like, would you be able to go and buy a house based on the money you made at a co-op, or would that all be collectivized?
Well, to your one point about like electing a Trump figure, one of the big problems I have with before I get to that, one of the big problems I would have with traditional firms is that if a business is mismanaged by a higher up in which nobody had really any control except the what's called the shareholders in getting to that position of power, and the business goes under and the workers are screwed. They didn't really have a say in it. But if there was a more democratic system, it would kind of give more responsibility to the people part of the business, give more responsibility to the people in the business, to actually show that they might have done something wrong to negatively affect the long-term success of the business, and they would feel more of a responsibility on that part. So I would say that if they elected like a Trump figure, that would kind of just be, the onus would be on them for not vetting their people properly. And in terms of the private property question, I would say that I am opposed to private property in terms of like owning businesses. I don't have an issue with buying houses. I think having your own place of residence and having a house is a wonderful thing. And I think that you could totally be able to go buy a house. I wouldn't say that like, government mandated houses sound kind of like an authoritarian, like China kind of situation, which I'm not comfortable with. I don't know if they do that in China, but it sounds kind of like something they would do.
Yeah, they don't actually necessarily do that in China. In China, it's that the government owns everything, and so even if you pay off your mortgage, you're still only leasing your condo for like 99 years from the party. That's kind of like how it works over there.
And if the government wanted to kick you out, you kind of don't have a say in the matter.
Yeah, basically, imagine the eminent domain that Trump was advocating for. Now multiply that by 1,000. That's what they have over there. So, like, literally, in order to build the Pudong district over in Shanghai, they just literally demolished tens of thousands of people's houses and built some skyscrapers so that they could put a propaganda piece to show the West. And a bunch of tankies like Infrared/Haas buy it up and make it as cover picture and everything.
They will romanticize they will make anything look good as long as it's their team doing it.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. It's great. But I'll say on the first answer that you gave about, well, private companies can screw up too. That's a good retort. That's a really good retort. That's a good response. I don't even agree, but it's an effective response. It's one of the more effective responses that anybody's ever actually given me in a debate like this. So, no, that's a good argument. I would disagree with it though on the morality, that I still think if you're a dummy or if you're smart but you want to give it to your dumb kid as a business, I still think that's your personal property, so it's your right to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a good retort to what happens if the co-op people are stupid. So,
mm-hmm.
I give you props there. On the second point though, about I guess kind of the opposition to the institution of private property or anything, I do think though that's a big reason why, because co-ops in and of themselves, even if everything were a co-op, under current circumstances with the current market as it stands right now with private property, I think you'd see slower growth, but you wouldn't see a crash. You wouldn't see even like Soviet style stagnation. But I think if you take away the private property, you really take away that long-term ownership aspect, that's where you really run the risk of having really slow growth, because now people don't necessarily feel as invested in something per se. Like, sure, they might have like a 1/10,000th share, but a lot of companies actually kind of do that right now. Like, you'll see that with even some big box stores and stuff where the managers will literally have a share in the company's stock performance, and yet you still sometimes see managers that hate their job, don't really care, kind of treat the whole thing like a joke, and yet they have a stake. For them personally, it's as if the company were like a co-op, and yet bad decisions still get made and whatnot. And so, how would you respond to that?
It's a problem in terms of like scale of pay. Like a stock options in companies are nice. Like at Amazon, pretty sure we get stock options too. But but they're not really like worth a lot unless you see a period of like rapid growth for the company. Like if you were an employee at Amazon like 10 years ago and you bought stock options, like you're probably not working at Amazon anymore. But I think that in a cooperative system, you would see much more direct variations to your compensation in terms of how well the company is doing, instead of just like maybe like a few $100s for stock options, or that you would make in stock options. And like the performance of the company is how much you're going to get paid, depending on what position you're on.
Right. Right. How would the stock market work though in this system? So, would you be able to go and buy stocks because you're not necessarily going to have voter rights, right? Like, how would that work? Like, what I know, I've seen an interview with Vosh where he was talking about how you could structure a co-op so like something like 60% of the profits went to the workers, but 40% was on the stock market. What do you make of that? Would it be 100%? Because the definition of socialism you gave was like basically total ownership by the workers. But how, I guess, how would you be able to compete, I guess, with the stock market system in that sense? Like I'm not like some big Wall Street guy. I've got a big problem with money lending in the long run. I got a huge problem with predatory lenders. I think they should be banned. I know people would say that that's authoritarian, but it does raise the question of how would you generate funds if you can't sell stocks outside of your people? But
I would say that while the business would probably be initially divvied up between the workers, I would leave the decision. It would probably be a situation where cooperative can probably vote to lend out a certain amount of shares to be bought on the stock market, up to a certain amount that's non-controlling. And if it's a risk they're willing to take in order to see further profits in the future, then I would be okay with that.
Okay, but what happens? Say you got a firm and they decide, or you got a co-op rather, and they decide that they're going to have 40% of the shares be sold off on the stock market, but because the 60% that are retained are owned by the workers have a controlling say over it. But what do you do though if you have a serious disagreement over how the company should be run? Like, would it be the sort of thing that it's literally 50% of the workers plus one determines how the company goes forward? Or is it more that you need a bigger sort of consensus of the workers in order to get the leadership together? Or is it simple majority plus one, or like simple majority?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Because that would make 30% technically the controlling share, or no, it wouldn't make 30% the controlling share. But like, let's say there was a dispute between labor within the company, so 30 plus one were split versus 29.99999%, but then 40% is owned in stocks. Let's say Jeff Bezos owns all the 40% of stocks, just hypothetically. Technically, then it's a co-op, but Jeff Bezos, who's not an employee, now has the majority, or not the majority, but the plurality share of say if labor's divided within the company. You see what I'm saying? Like, because even Vosh has said that he didn't necessarily see a problem with having the shares, a percentage of the shares available for market purchase, but I'm just using more of a crazy case here where the companies really split, but you do see that happen with strikes and stuff where labor gets really divided on issues. So
Yeah, I would say I would leave it up to, like I said, since it's like a voting tier system, I would probably leave it up to a like probably like probably the highest tier of the company to be able to make that executive decision. And if say like a majority of the workers are not happy with that decision, it would probably be going to a referendum. But typically, I wouldn't really, I don't know how comfortable I would be to give every single, like, like say you're all the way at the bottom as a worker in a cooperative. I don't know how well that would work out if we gave everybody like a say in huge decisions like that.
okay.
Like I said, there needs to be like some level of executive decision in order to in order to ensure the longevity of the company.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I guess we can move on. I did just want to touch on the mandate thing though. I guess just in the real world as we have it today and everything, you would see the only way, I guess, to get to where you want to be would be to mandate that companies transition to be co-ops within say X amount of years. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. I think there probably are other paths to do that I have not considered, and I'm always open to hearing better ideas on how to do that. But I would say, yeah, probably making like a mandate or slowly making workplaces more democratic, like say giving workers the ability to vote for councils within like specific specific places of business, firms within the wider business, and then moving up from there.
Okay. I guess the last point about co-ops that I touch on kind of goes into the innovation aspect of it is, say in a private firm, you've got the founders of it that take a tremendous amount of risk, put up a ton of money and everything. Whereas in a co-op, you don't necessarily have to endure the same amount of risk, but and yet you can derive some of the same controlling benefit from it. Some people would argue that the capitalist system is more fair because if you're a founder, sure, you can get rich like Jeff Bezos. You could also go bankrupt. And so, whereas if you're an employee, you're not going to go bankrupt being an employee. You're also not going to become Jeff Bezos. So,
Right. I think that the initial people who founded the company would probably, be at the higher tier of democratic councils, and you would probably only have access to vote in things after like a few years, or even you probably have to be with the company for probably like 20 years even to be able to like reap the benefits of something that like say a founder would.
okay, I gotcha. And then I guess the last kind of question I got about co-ops is what about like really small businesses? Like not even necessarily mom and pop shops, but like say 20 employees, that kind of thing. Um, would you require that all of them be co-ops, or would you not necessarily have a problem with small scale private enterprise?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have an issue with small scale enterprise.
Okay. That raises the question then where's the line approximately? Is it 500 employees, 100 employees, 5,000 employees? When would you have to register as a co-op, I guess, at some point?
It would probably that's a good question. I wouldn't say that I would have an exact defining line, but I think it'd be really interesting to think about like the minutia of going into how many employees would you have. It would probably be a combination of how many employees you have, how many different locations do you have of business, or you can meet like a certain profit threshold, probably something like that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I guess we can move on to the next sort of aspect of it, which is I guess how would you decommodify basic necessities, because you mentioned housing, you mentioned food. How would you do that in a way that wasn't, I guess, stifling to the economy either by expense or taking out of it that market aspect of it where you can't necessarily innovate on it anymore, or would it be a combination of private ownership, like you mentioned with houses, that you could own your own house? Um, I guess I'm just wondering, how would you do that? And also, if you could own your own house, how would you respond to Marxist critics that might say that that is still allowing for the commodification of property? You're just raising the floor from where we have homelessness right now.
Well, I would say like I would call myself a Marxist. I would say I've read a decent amount of Marxist theory, but I'm not like a dogmatist. I'm willing to admit that I disagree with like Marx's views on things and some things. I mean, he I don't even know, like 150 years ago, he could have never imagined the way capitalism has evolved. I mean, most Marxists back then thought that capitalism would have been abolished by now, and obviously it's still here. So I would say that like while I'm against private property abstractly, I think when people think of private property, they think of like just like things you own. But when I think of private property, I think just like in terms of being able to like set up a business and have autocratic control of it and reap the profits from it. But I am in complete favor of the protection of things like personal property, like houses, things like that, like any possessions you owned. Obviously, I don't want the government to be able to steal your things because they want to. Sorry, do you think you repeat part of the question?
Yeah, well, I guess just kind of to make it kind of succinct, what would decommodification of food, housing, and other aspects that you mentioned in the intro really look like from a policy level?
Oh, okay. So I look at the transition to socialism as a natural emergence from capitalism. I think, as did Marx, in that you need capitalism in order to make a socialist society, which I think projects such as the USSR and China have, kind of led to their authoritarianness, because they try to turn feudalism into socialism, which was a big mistake because you didn't have the infrastructure properly in order to implement, socialist policies correctly. But in my hypothetical socialist society, I would say that we would probably be kind of like post-scarcity, I would hope, where food wouldn't really be an issue, that we probably have a surplus of food. I mean, we have a surplus of food right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, we're not post-scarcity yet, but capitalism with a negative income tax, as I envision it, I think that over the long run that would produce a post-scarcity system.
Yeah.
But what would you respond to, though? Like, let's say I was right about that, just for the sake of argument here. Let's say that I'm right and we get a system like that where you can have $1 trillion, but nobody's homeless. It's not that there's a lot of income inequality, but even in the system that you're describing, it sounds like there would be an income inequality between the managers that are elected. It would just be a more democratic income inequality, I guess, is the difference. But
yeah, I would say I don't have a principled opposition to people making different amounts of money. I want people to be compensated correctly for how much they work. As a manager, you're probably doing much more work than the average worker. I'm just mostly concerned with people having access to the bare necessities of life to make life as liberating as possible.
Okay, but let's say that you had a post-scarcity capitalist system, and then you had a post-scarcity cooperative or market socialist system. For me personally, I believe that the post-scarcity capitalist system would have a higher rate of growth year over year than a market socialist one would. But I'm I'm open to reading any literature if you've got anything that you recommend. I've read some Marx back in the day when I was in university, but I'll read more stuff if you got any recommendations. But I would just say, though, that for me, if both produce a post-scarcity type system, which is something that I couldn't say about authoritarian socialism, we know for a fact that creates scarcity. But like, let's just say, benefit of doubt to both of us, we both have a post-scarcity system that we want. I get capitalism with negative income tax, basic income for those that need a safety net, and you get market socialism, and nobody's homeless or starving either. To me, I would still pick the one that still emphasize the personal property and the higher growth rate year over year. You're talking more from the standpoint of the liberty of the employees, but I'm kind of the view that a lot of the issues that you described, like, you have to work 3 jobs, so how can you necessarily put that much time or effort into something? I really believe if we had a straight up basic income for, like, the bottom 10% or whatever, well, most of the people that don't have any free time to focus on innovation or ingenuity in their own creative lives, that wouldn't be a thing anymore. And so I would argue that my system would be on the whole more productive, but I definitely would give you it. It wouldn't necessarily be as democratic in the workplace, but you'd have the freedom to go and work at a co-op if you wanted to, or you could work at a privately owned company. That would be what my world would look like. But what would you say to that? If they're both post scarcity, what's the justification for or not necessarily democratic socialism, market socialism?
I would say that another issue I have with capitalism is that it's kind of principled on this idea of infinite growth. The goal of a company is to make more and more profit, but I don't think that our current planet is able to sustain supposed infinite growth. I think that at some point we need to step back and realize that, hey, we have all these resources that are mostly controlled by the top 1%, and that if we were to realize that, hey, if we were to distribute all of these, all of these resources, and or not even redistribute, but have a system in which it wouldn't even need to be redistributed, it would just be put back into society as a whole. That we could have sustainable growth, but not to the point where it would negatively impact the climate crisis, or a company wouldn't just keep growing for the sake of its own.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess that leads me to another question then, which is that I've talked, I've given some benefit of the doubt from my perspective to co-ops, but I'm still talking about, the competitiveness of co-ops within a market condition, that they can be viable and sometimes they can outperform traditional firms, but that sub-traditional firms can outperform, especially if it's the original founder governing them still, they can outperform a lot of co-ops. But that's within still the context of ceteris paribus, everything else. But the system that you're describing, though, I'm guessing would probably have to have a far higher tax rate to fund other aspects of it, because you also mentioned that you support a welfare state, and so that can be pretty expensive. But I mean, I guess I don't want to go too long here. I'm definitely open to having a part 2 to focus on something else, but if you have the time. But I'm guessing your kind of system, and correct me if I'm wrong, you'd probably also be financing at the public level, probably universal healthcare, universal education, and a fairly robust welfare state, probably, right?
Mm-hmm. I would say that one of my end goals in a social society would probably be to make it so we wouldn't even need welfare. It would probably be a temporary solution to bring people up, and then once we're at the point where unions are strong, wages are high, then we wouldn't even need to give people welfare, except people who are disabled or have unfortunate life circumstances.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the goal for basic income too on my end, is it's like you want the system to be in the case where, there might be a few people that are on it because, things like they got disabled or whatever, but for the most part, people that would have otherwise been at that level of income are now, either owning their own business, or they figured out, their niche, that kind of thing. But I guess the thing for me is that when I look at the tax burden that you'd be placing upon co-ops. Even like I've said, look, some co-ops in our system can be more productive than traditional firms, but they also get taxed at the same rate. Whereas in the system that you're describing, you definitely require higher taxes than the system that I'm describing. And I think that the higher taxes, to a point, can actually stifle innovation to a point where even if you had a less efficient mode of operating, you could actually still have better outcomes. Like let's say we just agreed right now that co-ops were objectively better than traditional firms, all else equal, but the co-ops that exist in your system say have to pay 40% corporate taxes or co-op taxes, whereas in my system they'd have to pay an average of say 29 or 30%. Um, there's the argument to be made that a robust welfare state does result in slower innovation, and that over time it's not actually able to even necessarily fund itself so well, because of the tax burden that's imposed there. So like one reason why Norway's been able to survive as well as they have is that they've got a lot of oil and gas, but they also don't have as many regulations as say even the United States, in many industry sectors. And so I guess I guess it raises the question: would there be as many regulations on co-ops if they're co-ops? Would you trust them more? Because I'm not like one of those like libertarian guys that's like, oh, regulations are evil.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that the corporate motive leads them to do evil shit, but that it's the job of the government to basically say, look, we recognize that companies have a profit incentive. That's really good, but we need to hold them in check from the negative externalities of it. But say you had co-ops, would you give them more trust so you wouldn't have to regulate them as much, or would there still be a lot of regulations and high taxes in your system, or moderately high tax?
On the tax aspect, I would say that I would say that I'm not exactly committed to any kind of tax policy in terms of co-ops. I think that in my system that there would be since there would be less privatized things like healthcare and housing and stuff like that, that the markup done by private entities would probably be mitigated because it's coming directly from either from the government, who only needs to invest the bare minimum to get these resources out. Like like in the United States, insulin is kind of like a crazy high price compared to other countries, but if we cut out the private aspect, we wouldn't need to pay so much to have in taxes in order to have the service.
Okay.
But I would say that the regulations would probably be a very important aspect in terms of like preventing an exacerbation to things like climate change. I would want to hold any cooperative to account, because if they're still profit motivated, they will do anything to make a profit, such as companies now. And like you said, the government needs to keep them in check from overextending their ability to make profit while doing harm to the environment.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm open to having another debate even on, the innovation of the pharmaceutical industry, because one argument, maybe this is a little bit controversial, one argument that is that one of the reasons why drug prices are so high is that companies invest in so many dozens of drugs that wind up being a bust for them, that the ones that do succeed and make a breakthrough that they get to patent, they have to charge way more than the profit margin normally would be on any particular good. So like, let's say you make 50 lines of gum, different flavors of gum, and you charge the same profit rate on each of them. Well, now let's say you file for 50 patents on the gum, you only get accepted on one. You're probably going to have to charge 50 times higher on one piece of gum, one flavor, because you had to pay for the research and development on the others that didn't go anywhere. There is that argument to be made. And
yeah, to make up for the lost profit, or from the lost investment from the
so
other
you're paying, you're not just paying for the margin for what it costs them to produce a certain drug. You're also paying for all the other drugs that they tried to get to market to better the healthcare industry, but didn't actually go anywhere. And that if you were to just take that away, you might not have the same risk to go into these really, really expensive angles. And so one of the arguments that's made is that the reason why it's like that, that basically is the price of a really high and rapid rate of innovation. But I'm down to debate that separately, though. But I'll say, I've been asking a lot of questions and everything. I usually try to keep these debates around 1.5 hours, 1 hour and 45 minutes. But if you got questions for me, by all means, ask away, because like I'm representing the capitalist side here. So
yeah, let me think of one. Do you think that capitalist growth, companies doing whatever they can to make a profit, do you think that is unsustainable in any way?
Okay, well that's a good question. Infinite growth within the context of a few generations, I think is definitely practical. It really kind of depends. Like if we open up, say, asteroid mining, we open up to more of information technology, automation, artificial intelligence. I, I wouldn't say infinite growth. It's kind of a meme, but I would say long run, year over year expected real growth is 100% possible until our economy is stretching to the extent of the universe. Basically, I would say that there's always more that we can extract, and that we're almost, I wouldn't say we're moving towards like a post-physical economy anytime within the next few thousand years, but that there might come a point when, the entire growth is based on virtual stuff, which could in essence be infinite. But that's a little bit down the road. But even within a material economy, asteroid mining is one of those areas that would definitely open up substantial growth over what we have now, because you're bringing into new real estate basically that never existed before. So
it would bring in new resources in which were like virtually impossible to reach, and a lot of the economy right now is just through like data collection. But
I'll flip the question back to you though, which is that one criticism that's levied against capitalism is, well, infinite growth is flawed. It actually doesn't exist. But if you're advocating for market socialism, you're advocating that your system could do better. Would your system be able to provide a better long run growth than capitalist system would? Because I actually think that a market socialist system with co-ops and a capitalist system with a mix of firms and co-ops both could do infinite growth, as long as it's not like some totalitarian sort of thing. But I think that the capitalist one would grow faster. But what about your system? Because would you argue that you could also deliver like basically perpetual growth, or is that not the point, I guess?
I would say I do value the amount of growth capitalism has helped achieve undoubtedly. But I would say that in my opinion, we're kind of entering an era in which the amount of like the infinite growth meme or whatever that we're kind of approaching. I feel like that as we are getting more and more technologically advanced and more and have more resources at our disposal that we could give to people, that growing for growing a whole bunch is going to become less and less necessary. But I would say that over time, that the achievements of humanity, if we transition out of market socialism to full socialism, would probably be done collectively and socially, because it would be in all of our best interests to have better technology, better medical supplies, and better access to resources. So I think if we were to transition into a socialist society, that it wouldn't just be capitalists. It wouldn't be no longer be capitalists pushing that growth. It would be more of a collective social push for a better world.
Okay, I got you. Okay, that's your answer there, I guess. I got a quick question, and then you can ask me another question. And this one's probably easy because you've already said you're a libertarian socialist. But just in case anyone's wondering, what would you say if somebody says, well, what happens to the former CEOs like the Walton family if you're in power? Because you know that there'd be political ads about the Red Guard going around, all that kind of stuff and everything, right? Like those memes.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would be your response to that? What would happen to the Trump family? You know, like the most
Yeah.
greedy kinds of people.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'm not one of those people who was like execute the rich or anything. I would probably say that if we were to mandate co-ops from already existing mega corporations, that we would probably delegate a good chunk of money to them to compensate them because they are giving up their business. I would say that you would give them X amount of money for how much the business is worth and say be on your way.
Okay, well, that's a better way to do it than the forced appropriation thing that I've seen a lot of the techie bros do. If you actually came up with the funds to buy it for what it was fairly valued at, then I would still disagree with it on the principle of it's still their company, but at least they're getting paid. It's not just eminent domain bullshit like they do in China. So
yeah.
Okay. You got any more questions for me? Feel free. So.
I'm interested in knowing, like, in terms of how you want to see society, like what are the things that you prioritize?
Yeah, so you mean like on a domestic economy, or do you mean like the world, or do you mean culture, or
like what values do you hold that you use to help shape the world you want to see?
Gotcha. I use values like egalitarianism, equality of opportunity, liberty, the idea that you should be free to live your own truth, the idea that basically that you got to do the best that you can to realize your full potential, and on a whole, on a broader level, I would say that basically, as I say, world liberation or world solidarity, which sounds socialist, in the rhetoric. It's not. I'm obviously a liberal hawk. I support the Iraq war and everything. The idea that just because you're born in Afghanistan or you're born in Iraq, you have the exact same dignity as I do being born in Canada, for example. So for me, the long run thing is to get to a point where the whole world it looks like the West. That's not to say everywhere looks like Canada, like you've got cows and stuff and everything, or moose walking around, but it's to say that everybody has democracy, everybody has human rights, everybody has rule of law, so you can't just be arrested arbitrarily in the middle of the night without a warrant, that kind of stuff. Those to me are actually more important than any basic sort of personal financial gain. But some of the principles of capitalism are important to me, though, about the freedom and all that kind of stuff. But for me, myself, I'm actually pretty working class and everything. I devote a lot of my time to YouTube. I'm basically kind of an activist. I could be making a lot more money if I went into be like an investment banker or something, but I don't believe in predatory lending and all that kind of bullshit. So it's like, for me, I'm not like some greedy ass dude or whatever. I just recognize that the system that we have right now is great because it lets people do what they want, and not everybody wants to be Bill Gates, So.
Yeah, I would completely agree with all of the principles you laid out. Those are all values I hold, and I can tell that you believe in capitalism for those things, and not that like you're like a greedy, or that like you're a simp for the rich or anything.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's been a pretty good conversation so far. One of the more productive debates I've had. But if you got any more questions, feel free. Actually, I guess I could ask the same to you, but you already kind of mentioned that you had those 3 principles of the Enlightenment. But if there's anything else that you want to add to like your kind of aspirations for the values of humanity you'd want to see in a market socialist context, like I guess that raises a question. Would you want to see this universally in every corner of the world, or is this purely, I guess, a domestic thing in that case? Or would you say you want people in France and stuff to also have the same system?
I would say that obviously I would want any values I hold for like the system I want would be universalized. So obviously I would want it anywhere that it could be, because I believe it to be the most moral or the most freeing, because I believe I fundamentally believe in like freedom, and I want people to live the most genuine lives they possibly can without with limit to coercion. But I can only work within the country I'm in, so I think the best way to achieve that is to push for things I believe are good within my own country, and then have people push for whatever they need to in the other countries.
No, I gotcha. And so for me, the big thing for me on that point, and we don't need to get like sidetracked here too much. It's just that if you're in North Korea, you don't have the venue to push for what you need there. So you have to have external intervention. And so I'm totally open to debating that stuff as well. I know a lot of people that are libertarian socialists or are anti-war. I'm not sure if you would consider yourself anti-war or anything, but I know we wanted to debate economics, so we don't have to go into that in great detail. But
I would just say that I broadly recognize the imperialistic nature and harm that the American military has done, but I don't have a principled opposition to it, because I would say that I am a pragmatic interventionist, because I think us being in other places of the world can definitely be extremely valuable. Like, if I don't know how an engagement with North Korea would work, but I would say that there really isn't a way to liberate the people under North Korea without kind of an intervention.
Based. So, no, base. That's the most base thing I've heard somebody who identifies as a socialist say to me on foreign policy in a little while. That okay. Well, there's some common ground there. Anyway, if you got any other questions about any sort of stuff or capitalism, feel free.
The reason I came to debate, or the reason I wanted to debate you, is because I've seen you on you've been on Hippy Dippy plenty of times.
Yeah, right? I was gonna say you might be interested in Dylan Burns, because he's pretty left leaning. He's not 100% anti-war, though. He said there are cases for intervention in place.
Yeah, there definitely are. But like I know one of the topics in the most recent panel you've been on was critical race theory, and in the future I might be willing to talk about that, because I feel like that might be a little bit more contentious.
I don't know. I've gotten a lot of people that are huge critics of critical race theory that are super cringe and want to defund the military, and I don't agree with those people. So now for me, I'm not like I've dedicated a decent amount of my content to going after alt-right people like Nick Fuentes and all that kind of stuff. I despise racism and all that. My problem with critical race theory is that it's more about the specifics of the school of thought when it comes to basically things that are what is it? They're more viewed on an emotional level than an objective level. There are things like ignoring different sets of statistics to cast a race-coded narrative. But I've also seen critics of critical race theory, for example, almost glorify Derek Chauvin. And I've always said that Chauvin, my criticism with what happened with Chauvin is that I felt that because they had the trial in the same city and because they didn't necessarily sequester the jury, that I don't necessarily feel that he deserved, or that he got a fair trial. But I think that if he got a fair trial, he would have been probably convicted, and that'd be fine with me. And to see a lot of people just knee-jerk rush to defend him, it's almost irrational. And so a lot of the critics of critical race theory, it almost, you can never prove anything, but some of them you can make the argument that are coming from a place of racism. The counter, though, is that, well, some of the people of the critical race theory advocacy now argue that things like academia at large, or I guess what they would see as like European rationality, that this kind of stuff isn't something that Black people should participate in, and so I have an issue with that too. But I'm open to having a conversation about it, and I'll be straight up. Like in that debate on the Hippy Dippy show, it's not my most well-versed subject, and I'm open to having my mind changed on stuff. It's something that I've spent some time reading a little bit about and watching people talk about, but most of my focus, honestly, is on foreign policy these days. But
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah. Yeah, no. This has been an incredibly good faith and productive discussion.
well, yeah, we could do another debate though. I'm down to
Yeah.
debate, innovation in the healthcare sector. There's also the potential that we could have a debate over the role of the state at large, because I call myself a statist, but I'm not like a particularly authoritarian kind of person in any sort of sense, as I see it at least. But I do think, regulations, taxes, all that stuff have a role. I think that the state does essential services that the private market shouldn't even be allowed to compete in. And so in that area, sometimes people say that it's a little bit socialistic or whatever, which is kind of goofy. I think we could have a debate around there, though.
Yeah.
We could probably also have a debate around maybe even foreign policy to some extent. But yeah, no, I'll say, yeah, this has been one of the better faith debates. And, I've had some actually pretty, despite him being a literal Nazbol, Uncle Thomas, who I debated, was also a pretty cordial debate too. It's possible to have good faith discussions or debates with people of pretty different ideologies, and then you compare it to one of the debates that I had a few weeks ago with people that were formerly members of my community that have been absolute garbage, the most toxic, resorting to doxing, all kinds of stuff. It's like, wow. It is something to note for the record that a socialist and a capitalist had a more cordial debate than more conservative neocons and a liberal hawk. So that's something to know for the record. Anyway, if you guys, well, I'll say this is your opportunity to plug your content, where people can find you and where they can subscribe to you and everything. And if you got any sort of closing remarks for your side. So
yeah, I don't really have like any I don't really stream or make videos or anything, but I might at some point. But for now, I just have a Twitter at lucisevs with an S, because lucisev was taken. And finally, on the state thing, I think a state is very important. I disagree with a lot of anarchists saying that the state is kind of like a tyrannical oppressive force. I kind of come more from the social contract stance on that I think the state is the only thing to secure our rights.
Base.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I'm more of a Hobbes kind of perspective on the social contract, bit more dark view of human nature. Not to say that that humans are all evil. My worry, of course, is I've always said, I think, probably 95 to 97% of humans are totally good, and if you left them to their own devices, it's not like they're going to go around. My worry is always the 3% that are total psychopaths, and that you need somebody there to ensure that everybody plays by the rules to keep them at bay. I'm not one of those people who thinks that all humans are malicious. My problem is always like I said with the most brutal comrade. It's like if you have 99 people that mean well in the revolution and one dude that can't wait to line everybody up and get shot, guess who's going to be the great leader, right? It's like that's the thing, right? So and the state is like it's not even the state, because they would also have a state. For me, it's a state with rule of law, like Sweden, America, Canada, UK, that kind of thing, where you can't just be arbitrarily gulagged.
You have to be able to, you have to give up your right, certain rights to the Leviathan, in order to ensure your own rights,
it's so good, because there are libertarians out there. There are other people that call themselves libertarians that would say, where did I sign any contract? And it's so good to talk with a libertarian that doesn't do that shit, man. I'll say this, you have a good setup. I'd say probably get some background lighting and stuff. That'd be pretty swaggy. And start streaming, honestly, because I think there's a market. There's obviously a market for libertarian socialist content right now on YouTube and Twitch. And maybe if it works out and everything, maybe you can be the next Vosh. Because I'll tell you this, Hawes thought he was going to be the next Vosh. I don't want him to be the next Vosh. He's a goofball. He's a
infrared
lunatic.
is awful.
No, he's a loudmouth. I'd way rather have you get to 350,000 subs than him get to 350,000 subs. No, I don't sell yourself short, dude. You've already got more of a good setup than I had. I just had a backwards mic because I didn't even know how to use it when I started out. So definitely start streaming for sure.
All right. Well, I appreciate the support. I just might now.
No, literally. Yeah. And then I can go on your show and like, we'll talk about something over there and have a debate or whatever. It'd be pretty cool. So, yeah. Oh man. Ryan G, who's a patron of my channel, says he would Patreon your channel if you start one.
Oh, my pronouns are she, her, but yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Your pronouns are, okay. Your pronouns are she, her. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
It's no problem at all. I'm not offended.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. No, I apologize for that. So, yeah, no. So yeah, Ryan G was saying that he would be a patron of your channel, and yeah, so I didn't even have any patrons until like I think like 6 months into my channel. So
it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah. Anyway, there we go. So definitely, and that's the sort of thing, right? Is that obviously we have some areas of disagreement, but this has been one of the more productive debates. And oh yeah, $20 a month. That's pretty good. That's like 3 times the average Patreon. So that's some incentive there.
Yeah, no. Like this has been like I appreciate being able to for us to both be able to engage in each other's points, and it's been really interesting. It's you've asked questions in which I need to consider more, and there's always more things to consider.
Well, there we go. So that's the debate. This is a pretty good debate. If you want to debate me out there, DM me over on Twitter at Kevin Castley. We'll set up a debate too. And with that, thank you to everybody for watching. And I'll see you in the post show where I just go over my performance a little bit. And with that, have a good night, everybody. And thanks to lucisev for coming on.